Welcome to the second installment of How I Read, this one being Eightball by Daniel Clowes. He is published mainly by Fantagraphics in America, and he also has some books on Pantheon and also from Drawn and Quarterly. I thought about making this because in October 2023, his book Monica came out, and it was a very praised book. He automatically gets reviewed on big sites, newspapers, so called legitimate media. He's covered a bit on comic sites as well, but not that much because he just drops a book every 5 years or so now. And I sometimes would see posts in Reddit or Facebook comic groups by younger people who didn't know who he is and don't get the big deal. A lot of people don't realize just how important an artist he was, and it is, but when he was working in the 90s, he was a titan in the underground comic industry. The meat of this video is a breakdown of a story of his, but I'm going to start with an intro to his career. It's not too long, but I'll post time codes if you want to skip it. This is the stuff I could find that I have in my house from him. This is all his 8-balls, some odds and ends, the books he's been making since he ended 8-ball. There are other things he's worked on, but this is a normal Clowes collection, give or take the Lloyd Llewellyn on the left and the original art on the right. I'm going to break his oeuvre into 3 stages, and forgive me, I'm going to be a little off the cuff with this. So in his early days, he did 8-ball starting in the late 80s. And the first 10 issues or so, I call this his criticism phase. But it could well be called his rock throwing phase. He made a magazine that was somewhat similar to Mad Magazine. It would have about 3 or 4 stories in every issue and a couple one-pagers. And he just went after every single topic he could think of. He was really critical and quite negative, but really hilarious. And so he would just attack anything that he thought was mediocre or pretentious, and it killed. He has a story called My Suicide. Suicide, don't do it. But it'd be great if you could float around like a ghost and watch people mourn you. Or this picture from Dan Pussy, his takedown of comics, art comics. This is not Fantagraphics publisher Gary Groth using a thesaurus to figure out ways that he can talk about just how horrific this mainstream style comic is. Or this one, which is kind of based on Richie Rich, just about, it's a crazy fucking world. And it just covers everything. And he started doing some experiments too. This one strip, The Stroll, it's the entire story is written through his eyes, what he sees while he's walking down the street. That's it. What he's seeing, what's he thinking. He made it into a comic. And these were just they were really exciting and really fresh and usually really funny. And this 10-issue run, one of the reasons why it's lumped together is because of a lead story, Like a Velvet Glove Cast in Iron. This was serialized as the main feature in the first 10 issues. I consider it my least favorite of his works. It's more weird than it is what I'm into. But at the same time, whenever his name comes up, a lot of people swear on it. There are people who absolutely love this. And so, he's got good stuff that appeals to different people. But then somewhere around that 10th issue, up to that point, he'd largely just been criticizing bad comics and bad movies and bad attitude and hipsters and schlubs and pretentious people and general mediocrity. And then he just started shifting, and he started trying to see what he could do instead of pointing out what everyone else wasn't doing very well. And so I'm kind of calling this his blossoming phase. This is Neo in the Matrix. It's like all of a sudden he just realizes what power he has and what he can do. And he makes comics like no one was making at the time. I would say there are people making comparable works today, but he was making them in a way that people weren't when he was making them. The stories got a lot more serious. I remember I was in university when this was coming out, and he had coverage in art form because he was an artist. And yeah, these are very, very good stories. And also at times, it's still absolutely hilarious. Anyone who's read the story this panel I just showed is from, they're laughing right now. They're really laughing because they remember just how funny this story is. And this is also when Ghost World appeared in the book as the main story in issues 11 to 18. Ghost World is probably his most famous thing, and he ended up writing a screenplay for the movie, and it got him an Oscar nomination. I think it's good. But I don't think it's so much good as it is long. At that time, 15-page stories were not legitimate in the way that a book was that they could sell. And Ghost World it's a very good book, but I don't think it's his best work either. Not even for this era of his work. And then we have the last issues of Eightball, from issues 19 to 23 up to the present, where he has become a bookmaker rather than a comic maker. And he is an artist. He has gallery shows, and there are hardcover books. NPR wants to cover his stuff. He's a very respectable person. And he doesn't really participate in the comics world, like Jaime or Beto Hernandez of Love and Rockets. They might do something small for DC or somewhere, walking a line between their interests and their paychecks. Dan Clowes, he doesn't do that stuff. He's a capital A artist, and the stuff is quite serious, even when it's being fun. And some of it I absolutely love. To be honest, I love all of it, but it's possibly harder work to figure out and get attached to. I think an ambitious youth could write a thesis on any of these later works. I'll have some recommendations at the end of the video. But yeah, like, he's in a zone at this point. He's just making art. So today we're going to cover Like a Weed Joe. This was first published in 8-Ball 16, 1995. It's a sequel and a prequel of sorts to Blue Italian Shit, which appeared in issue 14. It features a metaphorically named character, Roger Young. I don't know if it is autobiographical, but there are some similarities to Clowes in terms of the age and the era it's set in. I'm going to go through the whole 9-page story. I'm not going to cover every panel, but I want to cover the main points, and then at the end I'll come back and look at some of the things that he's doing in the story. So to start, we have Roger, who is staying with his grandparents for the summer. He's not particularly thrilled to be with them in the middle of nowhere, as he describes it. He has a little fantasy in the lower right corner of being a baseball hero. The whole story is narrated by Roger, and right from the start, he's trying to ingratiate himself with the reader. It was easy to believe my own delusions. There were only two frail and enthusiastically indulgent old people around to judge me. At times, I felt nearly superhuman. In the lower left panel, he's talking about how he was becoming withdrawn and passive, in the words of his school psychologist. I think the concept here is he's really sharing personal things, so he's really building up trust with the reader. He's being straight, Who admits that they go to a school psychologist at the start of a conversation? He also euphemistically admits that he's going through puberty at the time. His life at his grandparents' house is quite boring, and the exciting event is that some family comes to stay at one of the empty cottages near his house. We see him basically stalking the house and taking a look at the family. He finds the daughter's bikini hanging on the clothing line, and he calls this hitting the jackpot. He says he didn't touch it, but he did smell it, as weird as that sounds. His summer is quite boring. He's doing things with his grandfather that he's a little too old for. And he admits that he's quite embarrassed of his grandfather, and in retrospect, really loves him. But at the time, he was very frustrated. He also admits that he became a little obsessive of this girl that was staying nearby, and he memorized her schedule. He says he was in deep contemplation, and also he was spying on her from the bushes. And as the summer goes along, he says that his fantasies are starting to shift into rehearsals for telling people all about the sex stuff that he did in the summer. And he thinks about his feelings of this girl staying nearby, and he describes it as a kind of romantic despair, an expression of unfiltered emotion. He says it was revealed as trite and pointless in the daylight. The image here is quite nice, and it becomes quite relevant to the story. He's writing, I love you in the sand. And we're introduced to Bemis or Bemis, I'm not sure. Bemis, he's a difficult guy, 2 years older with a bad attitude. He is a bad local dude. The first thing you see Bemis saying is, are you adopted or did your parents fuck for you? He talks a lot about sex. And Roger is talking tough too. And and then I'd pull out a 44 Magnum and watch them shit their pants. Roger admits that in no time at all, I had adopted his narrow, detached vocabulary and taking it with shockingly little effort to a new level. I guess it's pretty clear that I've got my own problems. The story goes along as summer passes by. Again, we see something written in the sand, possibly by the girl, but it is illegible. You can make out a few letters, but it's illegible. And here we see Roger drawing a heart in the sand. He describes this as a restless fever of romantic delusion. There's a short experience at the circus, and again, he's too old for this, but he's still kind of loving it. And for some reason, he brought Bemis to the circus with him. Bemis has a way with words. That red-haired chick is sweet. I really like the text up here on the upper right. He was a creep, plain and simple, but he never pretended otherwise. Being a creep gives you a lot of freedom at that age. So Bemis is staying over with Roger, and they're going to do some stalking in the bushes together. We get an image of the girl that he's stalking, and that's the closest Roger ever got to her. Bemis joins Roger in writing in the sand. I don't even know what he's writing. Bemis is a pitiable character. Like, he's a jerk, but you would imagine he's permanently frustrated at trying to function in the world. Here, Bemis and Roger throw rocks at a seagull, and Roger, with baseball as his hobby, manages to make a connection. Bemis finishes off the bird in an act of compassion. And later, Bemis sneaks up to the family's house and he steals a pair of her bikini bottoms. I'm not even going to read what he's saying here. You can read it. The upper right panel is what I would consider the key to this entire story. He's shown these where you couldn't read what was written. The words are shown as illegible. But in this panel, it's different. His narration: the next morning, there was another message on the beach. It couldn't have been there very long, but it had been trampled and windblown like the others, and was just as impossible to read. But we can read it. It says, what the fuck is your problem? And so with that, the family leaves their summer cottage and Roger goes on with his life. The final narration reads, at the end of summer, it was decided that I should keep on living with my grandparents. We moved back to the city. My grandfather needed surgery, and I went to a new school where I struggled to be thought of as someone who housed a vital and complicated inner world. Nearly 30 years after reading this for the first time, I still think that sentence is one of the finest pieces of writing in comics, movies, books. It's just a bold and true final sentence. It's a great way to end a story. So now I want to look at what I think really puts this far and beyond simply mature fiction done in a comic style. This is truly fiction that works in comics, and that would lose a whole dimension if it was done in another medium. At the time, I really wanted to know what Clowes was doing, and so I would read interviews, or if I saw something with him in it, I would buy it. For years, I thought I had read a long interview with him in the Comics Journal, and just while making this video, I looked at this cover. I've never read this interview, so what I want to talk about from here, it's not in this book. It comes in one of these. Either it was in this Uberzine on Dan Clowes called The Imp, or it was in a long interview in this book, Dangerous Drawings. These are two long interviews with him that I read. In one of these interviews, he talks about Vladimir Nabokov as a writer and what he really, and as someone he really looks up to. I've read a bunch of Nabokov, and just to make it easy, I'm going to talk about Lolita. This book is very, very well known, as well as being very, very misinterpreted. Sadly, it's often considered a sexy book. It's not a sexy book. It's a book about a pedophile who abducts a 14-year-old girl. Nabokov did a lot of things with narrators and the unreliable narrator and played with the reader's expectations. In Lolita, the pedophile is a university professor who drops French words into his speech and seems like a very intelligent, educated man. He narrates the story. He's the one saying that Lolita seduced him, not the other way around. He was an adult and she was a child and he was a pedophile. That's the truth of the story. It's a frighteningly realistic story because you hear about stories of abuse and often the man will say, "Oh, they didn't even know there was a problem." And they will always say that the victim wanted it and they were the ones who made him do such things. Nabokov was disgusted at these types of people, and that's what he was getting at with this story. That is to say that the facts conflict with the narrator's point of view in the story. And that's the method that Clowes is using in this story as well. He's telling us a story from Roger's point of view, and at the same time, he's showing us things that happen that contradict the story, more or less. This panel is the obvious one. He's saying it's impossible to read, and the image is quite clear to read. So this is definitely a conflict between the narrator and the image, but there's other ways that I think it happens too. He says that he has romantic despair. He says that he has this romantic delusion. The truth is, he was masturbating to her bikini bottoms by himself one night. And this is not to judge the character, like, whatever, he's 13, 14 years old. 13-year-old boys can be literally insane with sex, and he has said that he had just become a man in terms of reproduction. He was probably losing his mind in a puberty sort of way. But as much as he'd like to remember this as a kind of romantic feeling, it was definitely much less than that. But I also see this with how he credits Bemis with the way he behaves over the course of the summer. He says he adopted Bemis's narrow, detached vocabulary and took it to a new level. It's pretty clear I've got my own problems. Roger seems to take responsibility for himself, but look at what Bemis says according to what the book shows. Bemis only talks about sex. Roger's the one calling his grandparents fossils. He's the one talking shit. Even the part about throwing rocks at seagulls, Roger's the one who hits the bird with the rock. Possibly Bemis is a catalyst releasing Roger's inner nastiness, but this is mostly him doing this on his own. And so we get back to the start of the story and think about some other parts of Roger's personality that he's acknowledged to us. He's crafting things that he can say to his friends at school so they'll have a certain image of him. And when he leaves us, he's thinking of ways that he can represent himself to others so that they will see him as a deep person that he wants to be seen as. So that's what's great about this story. It's ambiguous. We can't say if the images in the comic are simply the reality of the story or if they're Roger's memory of the story. Maybe Rogers remembered the story the way he tells it because that's what he took away from it at the time. Maybe he knows every detail shown in the story, but he tells it as he does because he wants the reader to feel he houses a vital and complicated inner world. I would lean towards a second reading, and we don't know, though, because the story has ambiguity built into it. So many stories and so many comics are very didactic, and how they tell their stories. There's X problem and it's solved in Y way. This story doesn't even have that much of a plot to it. It's a series of anecdotes. But at the end of it, there is something to puzzle about, and that panel with him on the beach, This is inviting you to really think about what this dude is saying and why he's saying it, and it makes the story worth reflecting on that fact. And reading this, I think back about my own life and how I view my own memories and how my memories might look compared to reality. I could use a lot more stories like this in my comics. I could use a lot more books that make me want to think about them when I'm done with them. This was how I read Eightball by Danny Clowes. As a recommendation, I cannot recommend the complete Eightball enough. While it probably loses something in the distance of time, it is still one of the greatest achievements of comics, in my opinion. I think a lot of the artists, as they grow, they get tighter in their art, they get sharper in how they tell their stories, and that's not what Clowes did. Clowes blossomed like a flower. The art got tighter and the stories got sharper, but the complexity of the stories just grew and grew. And as he goes along in the run, it takes different kinds of thinking and brain power to process the stories that he's telling. There are very few artists you could say something comparable with. You can just start from issue 1 and go to issue 18 and see a person becoming a next level artist. It's an incredible experience. Another favorite is Ice Haven, which is a story told in comic strips. He goes from character to character, and each one gets their own comic strip style to suit them. There could be something like a Sunday Funny, another is like a noir, and just page after page is different styles of comic strips reflecting the character to tell a bigger story. It's a real piece of work. The other one I really love is The Death Ray, a superhero adjacent story. And I'll just say in a nutshell, what I like about this book is that in a lot of media, when you see someone packing heat and carrying a gun, it's showing masculinity and power. With Clowes, guys who carry guns are usually emotionally impotent characters. This Death Ray character, the degree to which he's holding or using his gun reflects on how low his self-esteem is. I'd still read superheroes at this age, and because I like it. But this book really colored how I looked at people who live and breathe by the genre. Thanks so much for making it to the end of the video. Keep reading things that deserve to be read, and think about how we can build genuine communities in this time of corporate exploitation. Thank you.